What if the biggest lie about the war on drugs isn't about drugs at all? This episode reveals how one university course challenged everything I thought I knew about addiction, race, power, and compassion. Welcome back to Women on the Brink, podcast where we have honest conversations about the issues that shape our lives as women. I'm really glad you're here. Today's episode is a little different because I want to share something that I learned while taking an anthropology course at UBC. I just finished the course and I expected to learn about, different cultures and human evolution, but I didn't expect the course to completely change the way I think about racism. Like many people, I grew up believing racism was mostly about individuals saying or doing hurtful things to one another. But anthropology taught me that racism is much bigger than that. It's about history, power, and systems we've built over generations. And one of the biggest takeaways for me was learning that race isn't biological, it's a social construct. Humans are incredibly similar genetically, but throughout history, people created racial categories to justify slavery, colonialism, and unequal treatment. And those ideas became embedded in institutions, laws, education, and even in our healthcare. And, even though we've made lots of progress, those systems haven't completely or simply just disappeared. Here in Canada, we often pride ourselves on being multicultural and inclusive, and that's something to celebrate for sure. But anthropology also taught me that being proud of diversity doesn't mean racism no longer exists. We still see Indigenous communities facing the lasting effects of colonialism. We hear stories about unequal healthcare and discrimination in the justice system and missing opportunities in education and employment. And we also know that many Black, Asian, Muslim, and immigrant communities continue to experience prejudice and barriers that others don't have to think about. And as women, I think this conversation matters even more. Anthropology introduced me to the idea of intersectionality, the understanding that people can experience multiple forms of discrimination at the same time. So a woman may face sexism because she's a woman, but if she's also Indigenous, Black, Muslim, or from another racialized community, racism can compound these experiences. Think about the workplace. A racialized woman may have to work harder to be seen as competent, or may be passed over for promotions, or may feel pressure to fit into expectations that weren't designed with her in mind. Think about the healthcare. Research has shown that racial bias can affect how women's pain is recognized or treated. Think about everyday life, from assumptions people make to comments that seem small but built up over time. These aren't isolated experiences. They're part of larger patterns that encourages us to examine rather than ignore. And one part of my anthropology course that genuinely surprised me was our discussion about the anthropology of drugs. I'd always assumed, the so-called war on drugs was primarily about reducing drug use and protecting, public health. Instead, I learned that many anthropologists and historians would argue that it has actually been deeply intertwined with race and social control. In the United States, scholars have shown how drug laws and policy disproportionately targeted Black communities after the end of legal segregation, contributing to what, many people describe as a continuation of the Jim Crow system through mass incarceration. Meanwhile, when opioid addiction devastated predominantly white middle-class communities, the public conversation shifted dramatically, and rather than being portrayed as criminals, many were recognized as victims of aggressive pharmaceutical marketing and overprescribing by doctors and failures within the healthcare system. The response became one of treatment and compassion rather than punishment when it was with the white population. And as a Canadian, I couldn't help but ask whether we have our own version of this story. Looking at our treatment of Indigenous peoples, it's difficult to ignore the parallels. Indigenous communities continue to be disproportionately affected by policing, incarceration, and unequal access to healthcare. And here in Vancouver's downtown east side, people living with addiction are still frequently stigmatized and blamed for their circumstances instead of being treated with dignity and comprehensive healthcare. Anthropology really challenged me to see addiction not simply as an individual failure, but as something shaped by history and trauma, poverty, colonization, and public policy, and an inaccurate narrative. That perspective completely changed the way I think about drug use, racism, and what justice should actually look like. So, one thing I really appreciated about this course was that it didn't leave me feeling hopeless. Instead, it challenged me to ask better questions like, how do we create a society where everyone feels seen and respected? And how do we recognize our own assumptions about drugs, people of color, Indigenous people, women? How do we become better listeners instead of assuming we already know someone else's experience? I think those questions are incredibly important, not just in classrooms, but around our dinner tables, at work, and within our own friendships, right? So, where do we go from here? Well, for me, the answer starts with education. We need to continue teaching accurate history, including Canada's history of colonialism, residential schools, immigration, and systemic racism. But we also need to make sure that we're telling women's stories. And, too often history has been told through the lens of those in power, leaving out the voices of Indigenous women and Black women and immigrant women and other racialized women whose experiences reveal how racism and sexism often work together. And when we understand those stories, we begin to see that inequality isn't accidental. It's actually shaped by history, policy, and the choices we make as a society. And once we see it, we have a responsibility to do something about it. We also need policies that create equal opportunities in education, employment, housing, and healthcare, and not just for some Canadians, but for everyone. As women, we can make a difference in our everyday lives. We can amplify voices that aren't always heard. We can challenge stereotypes when we hear them. We can mentor younger women. We can support businesses owned by Indigenous women and women from diverse communities. And perhaps most importantly, we can remain curious rather than defensive. Anthropology reminded me that understanding another person's experience begins with listening. So this course didn't give me all the answers, but it sure did change the questions that I ask. Instead of asking whether racism still exists, I find myself asking how it continues to shape people's lives and what role I can play in creating something better. And I think that's a more meaningful conversation. So thanks for spending this time with me today. Until next time, remember that learning doesn't stop when the class ends. Sometimes the most important lessons are the ones we carry into our everyday lives. Take care, and I'll see you next time on Women on the Brink.